What if I told you that the man everyone ignored, the man who was judged for his old clothes, turned out to be the greatest hero this town had ever known? Imagine walking into a place, only to be turned away, not because of who you are, but because of how you look. That's exactly what happened to Frank, but what no one expected was the truth about his past, one that would leave an entire town in shock. Stay with me, because this story will change the way you see people forever. Frank Mitchell ambled down the familiar streets of his small town, his aged hands clasped behind his back. At 75, the retired firefighter wore his years like a badge of honor, each wrinkle on his face telling a story of brave deeds and selfless acts. As he passed the old oak tree in the town square, a warm smile spread across his face, greeting the familiar faces who waved back at him. "Morning, Frank," called out Mrs. Thompson, her arms laden with groceries. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Need any help with those?" he replied, ever the gentleman. "Just making it through another day, dear," she chuckled, her eyes twinkling with fondness. But unbeknownst to Frank, judgmental eyes lurked in the shadows. The arrival of Jake Reynolds, a wealthy newcomer with an air of superiority, had stirred an undercurrent of tension in the town. Jake leaned against the entrance of his upscale restaurant, his tailored suit a stark contrast to Frank's worn-out jeans and faded flannel shirt. As Frank continued his stroll, Jake exchanged glances with his patrons, smirking at Frank's humble appearance. Later, Frank decided to treat himself to lunch at Jake's newly opened restaurant, unaware of the hostile atmosphere awaiting him. As he stepped inside, the chatter fell to an awkward silence, and the patrons shifted in their seats, shooting disapproving glances at his attire. The sound of cutlery clattering abruptly ceased, replaced by whispers that filled the air like a thick fog. Jake, sensing the tension, approached Frank with an exaggerated smile that belied his true intentions. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "but I think it might be best if you took your meal somewhere else. We have a certain image to maintain here." Frank's heart sank, but he kept his composure. "I just wanted a simple lunch, that's all," he replied, his voice steady but laced with hurt. "Perhaps a diner would be more fitting," Jake shot back, crossing his arms defiantly. With a heavy heart, Frank turned to leave, the air thick with disdain. Unbeknownst to him, Maggie Turner, the owner of the local cafe, had witnessed the entire encounter from a distance. Her heart raced with indignation at the humiliation of the town's beloved hero. As Frank stepped back onto the street, he was unaware that the seeds of community solidarity were about to be sown, igniting a movement that would reveal the true worth of a man far beyond the clothes he wore. As Frank stepped out of the restaurant, the weight of humiliation hung heavy on his shoulders. He walked slowly, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn coat, trying to shake off the sting of Jake Reynolds' words. Just then, Maggie Turner hurried to catch up with him, her expression a mix of anger and concern. "Frank," she called, her voice carrying urgency. He turned around, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You shouldn't have to put up with that kind of treatment. It's disgraceful," she continued, her fists clenched at her sides. "Ah, Maggie, it's just a restaurant," Frank replied, his tone dismissive, though his heart ached. "People like their fancy places. I'm just an old man in old clothes." "Don't you dare downplay this," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "You're not just some old man, you're Frank Mitchell, a hero. The town needs to know what you've done for us over the years." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't do those things for recognition, Maggie. I did them because it was right." "Exactly, and that's why everyone should know," she insisted, tapping her phone with determination. "I'm going to share your story. People need to remember who you are." Later that evening, Maggie sat at her cafe, fingers flying over the keyboard as she crafted a heartfelt post. She shared tales of Frank's bravery, how he had saved lives during fires, how he had been a steadfast presence in the community. "Frank Mitchell is more than his clothes," she typed fervently. "He's a symbol of courage and selflessness." As she hit post, the notifications began to flood in. Within minutes, comments poured in from townsfolk sharing their own anecdotes about Frank, stories of him helping a lost child find their way home, or volunteering at the local shelter. The more they shared, the more the town remembered the man behind the humble exterior. Meanwhile, Jake Reynolds awoke to his phone buzzing furiously beside him. Confused, he scrolled through the notifications, his expression shifting from annoyance to disbelief as he read the posts. The tide was turning, and the community was uniting in support of Frank Mitchell. The sun rose over the small town, casting a warm glow on the gathering crowd outside Jake Reynolds' upscale restaurant. Signs were held high, each one a testament to the community's support for Frank Mitchell. "True heroes wear hearts, not labels," shouted one enthusiastic supporter while another sign read, "Frank Mitchell is our inspiration." The chants echoed through the streets, a chorus of voices rising in solidarity. If this story is already making you feel something, imagine how many others need to hear this lesson. Hit the like button right now so more people can see this powerful message. And tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone being judged unfairly? Let's spread kindness together. Frank stood a few blocks away, watching the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. He had spent his life serving others, never expecting to be the center of attention. "I didn't ask for this," he murmured to himself, shaking his head gently. Maggie Turner, the local cafe owner, approached him, her fiery spirit evident in her determined stride. "Frank, you deserve this. They're here to recognize you for all those years of selfless service," she said, her eyes sparkling with conviction. "I just did what any firefighter would do," Frank replied, his voice tinged with humility. "Exactly. And now it's time for everyone to know it," she insisted, gesturing toward the crowd. "Let's go." Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, Jake Reynolds paced nervously, his confident facade cracking under the pressure of public scrutiny. As the Mayor Bennett arrived on the scene, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The mayor approached Jake with an air of authority, arms crossed and brow furrowed. "Jake, this is unacceptable. Frank Mitchell has dedicated his life to this community. How could you treat him that way?" Mayor Bennett's voice was steady but firm, each word underscoring the gravity of the situation. Jake swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't know," the mayor interrupted. "You disrespected a hero, and now the community is here to remind you of what he's done. Frank saved lives, Jake. He deserves our respect, not scorn." Outside, the crowd continued to chant Frank's name, their voices steady and unwavering. Each person present carried a piece of Frank's legacy in their heart, and they were determined to make it known. "Look at them, Jake." The mayor gestured toward the signs and faces brimming with pride. "They're here for him, not you. It's time you acknowledge what really matters." Jake, feeling cornered by the weight of his actions, attempted to backtrack. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was just trying to maintain a certain atmosphere for my restaurant." The crowd erupted with shouts, recounting personal anecdotes about Frank's bravery, how he had rushed into burning buildings, how he had comforted families in crisis. Each story was a blow to Jake's feeble defense, and he could feel the tide turning against him. "Frank helped my family when we lost our house," shouted a woman at the front, her voice rising above the rest. The crowd echoed her sentiments, their collective voice a powerful reminder of the impact Frank had on their lives. As the mayor continued to confront Jake, Frank stood on the outskirts, realizing that the community had rallied for him in a way he never imagined. And in that moment he understood. True worth is measured not in clothes or status, but in the lives one touches and the love one gives freely. As the crowd outside Jake's restaurant grew restless, a local man stepped forward, gripping a makeshift microphone, his hands trembling with emotion. "I have to share this," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs of support for Frank. "Frank saved my grandson. It was a cold winter night, and our house caught fire. I thought I'd lost everything until Frank rushed in, fearless." The crowd listened intently, their eyes widening with each word. "He carried my boy out, just as the flames were about to engulf him. I'll never forget that night. Frank is a true hero." Applause erupted, echoing through the streets, and Frank's cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and pride. He stood quietly, appreciating the unexpected tribute. The townsfolk began to chant his name, their voices merging into a powerful wave of admiration. "Frank! Frank! Frank!" The sound reverberated through the small town, drowning out Jake's earlier arrogance. Encouraged by the momentum, another townsfolk stepped forward, holding up an old newspaper clipping. "Look at this," she exclaimed. "This was from when Frank saved the school from that terrible blaze. He didn't think twice. He just went in." The crowd leaned in, and whispers of hero rippled through them. Soon more people joined in, bringing forth yellowed clippings and tales of bravery that painted an illustrious picture of Frank's life. Jake, once brimming with confidence, now felt the weight of his actions crushing down on him. He shifted uneasily, realizing that he had underestimated the depth of Frank's legacy. The community's love for Frank was palpable, a stark contrast to his own superficiality. In that moment, Jake felt the urge to make amends. He approached Frank, his bravado stripped away. "Frank," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to apologize. I was wrong to judge you based on appearances." Frank turned to him, his face a mask of humility. "You know, Jake, true worth isn't defined by what we wear or how much money we have. It's about our actions and how we treat others." Jake nodded, absorbing Frank's words. The crowd continued to cheer for Frank, their support unwavering. But in that intimate exchange, Frank had shown Jake that redemption was possible, even after the deepest humiliation. As the sun shone brightly over the small town, excitement filled the air. Maggie stood in front of the cafe, her heart racing with anticipation. "All right, everyone, listen up," she called out, drawing the attention of the gathered townsfolk. "We're going to honor Frank Mitchell with a special day dedicated to him. Frank Mitchell Day. What do you think?" Cheers erupted from the crowd, and a sense of unity swept over them. Old and young alike shared smiles, their eyes sparkling with admiration for the retired firefighter who had touched so many lives. "I'll help with the decorations," shouted Mrs. Henderson, a local teacher. "And I can bake a cake," chimed in Tommy, the bakery owner, his face beaming with enthusiasm. Maggie smiled, feeling the warmth of the community's spirit. "Let's make it a day to remember, celebrating all that Frank has done for us." Meanwhile, Jake Reynolds watched from a distance, his mind churning with resentment. The sting of humiliation still lingered from the previous days, and he felt desperate to regain control. "I can't let this happen," he muttered to himself, pacing nervously. "If they think Frank is a hero, they'll never look at me the same way again." A sinister plan began to formulate in his mind, a way to undermine the event and reveal what he believed to be the truth about Frank. As the preparations for the event grew in intensity, the town buzzed with excitement. Banners were hung, tables were set, and a stage was erected in the park. Frank, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the brewing tension. He ambled through the park, touched by the kindness of his neighbors and the love they were showing him. "You're all too kind," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm just doing what I can." The day of the event finally arrived, and the park was filled with laughter and chatter. People gathered, sharing stories of Frank's heroism, while food and music created an atmosphere of joy. Frank stood at the center, his heart swelling with gratitude. Yet, in the shadows, Jake lurked, his expression dark and brooding as he watched the festivities unfold. "Just wait," he whispered to himself, plotting his next move. "This isn't over." As the sun shone brightly over the park, laughter and music filled the air, signaling the start of the community celebration for Frank Mitchell. Families gathered, children ran about with painted faces, and the aroma of barbecue wafted through the crowd. Just as Maggie stepped up to the microphone to welcome everyone, a figure pushed through the throng. Jake Reynolds, his expression a mix of arrogance and desperation. "Excuse me, everyone," Jake called out, his voice cutting through the festive atmosphere. The crowd turned, murmurs of confusion rippling through the audience. "I think it's time we had a little chat about Frank Mitchell." The sudden shift in energy was palpable, and Frank's smile faltered as he looked at Jake, sensing trouble. "What are you doing, Jake?" Maggie whispered, her eyes narrowing in concern. Jake smirked, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "I've uncovered something that might change how you all see your so-called hero. Frank isn't the man you think he is." Gasps echoed through the crowd, and Frank's heart sank. "Jake, please," he murmured, but the damage was done. Before Jake could continue, an unexpected voice emerged from the crowd. "That's not true!" A tall figure stepped forward. James, Frank's former partner from the fire department, his uniform still crisp despite the years. "I worked alongside Frank for years. He saved my life during the Riverside fire. Don't let this man twist the truth." The crowd began to murmur again, this time in support of Frank. "Tell us more," someone shouted, and others echoed the sentiment. James took a deep breath, his eyes fierce with loyalty. "That day the flames were raging and I was trapped. Frank didn't hesitate. He charged in, pulled me out, and then went back for others. He's a true hero." Cheers erupted, drowning out Jake's protest. Frank looked at James, his heart swelling with gratitude and disbelief. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course I did," James replied with a smile. "You deserve to be honored today, Frank." Jake's face paled as the crowd turned their backs on him, chanting Frank's name. "This isn't how it should be," he shouted, but his words were lost in the wave of support for Frank. Overwhelmed, Frank stepped forward, wiping away a tear. "Thank you, everyone. This isn't just about me, it's about kindness, compassion, and the love we share as a community. True heroism lies in our actions and the lives we touch, not in what we wear or how much money we have." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, laughter and cheers filled the air once more. The townsfolk united in celebration, while Jake slipped away, realizing that in his pursuit of status, he had missed the essence of what truly mattered. The day ended in a heartwarming embrace of community, reinforcing the lesson that greatness comes from humility and the bonds we forge with one another. If this story touched your heart, then you belong to a special group of people who still believe in respect and humility. Don't miss out on more stories like this. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell. And if you know someone who needs to hear this lesson, share this video with them. Let's remind the world that true worth isn't measured by appearances.